It wasn't just undercooked, it was deadly. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below. Your thoughts always bring warmth to these cold cases. Here we go. If there's one thing that can ruffle Nero Wolfe's well-marbled calm, more than a client who wants a rush job, it's a steak that insults the cow by being served raw. That may be overstating it. I'm known to do that. But Wolfe's relationship with food is sacred, and the man considers culinary mishandling not just a sin, but a species of treason. So when the doorbell rang at precisely 6:52 on a Tuesday evening, 7 minutes before Fritz was scheduled to bring in a porterhouse cooked to Wolfe's precise specifications, I was ready to bar the door like a bouncer at a speakeasy. "Archie," Wolfe said, not even bothering to look up from his copy of La Gastronomie Française, "if that is who I suspect it is, I will not see him. You may inform him that I am at dinner." "Sure," I said. "But if it turns out to be Inspector Kramer with a search warrant and a bad attitude, do you want me to show him your certificate of indigestion?" I went to the door. It wasn't Kramer, and it wasn't a process server. It was a short, barrel-chested man in a camel overcoat with the kind of face you'd expect to find on a beef magnate or a bare-knuckle boxing promoter. Square, meaty, and decorated with a moustache that had clearly been styled to look expensive. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, pushing past me like I was holding the door to a subway car, "is expecting me." "He most certainly is not," I replied, stepping in front of him before he could reach the threshold of the office. "But if you'd like to leave your name and your blood type, I'd be happy to pass them along after the digestion process begins. Tell him it's Reuben Hackett. He'll want to talk to me. It's about meat." That gave me half a pause. Not a full one. But when you live in a house where beef is practically worshipped and Fritz wears white like a priest preparing sacraments, the word meat carries some weight. I gave him a look, then headed for the dining room. Wolfe was already seated, napkin across his chest like a general wearing his sash. Fritz had just arrived with the steak, steaming, garnished, and cut with the loving precision of a Swiss horologist. "He says it's about meat," I said. "His name is Reuben Hackett. Ring any bells?" Wolfe sniffed, not like a man doubting his own food, but like someone considering whether to tolerate a minor heresy. "Reuben Hackett," he repeated. "The Hackett Packing Company?" "Could be. He's got the look and the shoulders, and he practically fought his way in." Wolfe's mouth tightened. "Confounded impudence. Bring him in. Then see that he does not speak until I have finished." "Chewing?" I went back and gestured Hackett inside. He followed with the sort of hesitant awe people get when they realize they're walking into a place where someone else sets the rules, and those rules are older than you, me, and the price of steak combined. Wolfe didn't rise naturally. He didn't offer a handshake or even a greeting. He finished his bite, sipped his beer, dabbed at his lips with a linen napkin, and regarded Hackett as if deciding whether he was fit for human consumption. "State your business," he said at last. Hackett, clearly unused to being kept waiting, especially by a man who refused to leave his chair, cleared his throat. "I've come because someone's trying to ruin me, quietly, from the inside. And it started with a steak." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow, but did not otherwise react. I took my post near the wall, notebook at the ready, which I would fill with useful details, snide comments, and, more often than not, useless digressions from the suspects themselves. Hackett went on. "I own Hackett Packing. You may have heard of it. We provide high-grade beef to half the city's best restaurants. Lately, some of our deliveries have been altered, just enough to create embarrassment. Sometimes a cut is wrong. Sometimes the temperature drops just enough in transit to spoil a load. Sometimes a whole order goes missing from the manifest. It's subtle, but it's enough to cost me contracts, reputation, confidence." Wolfe frowned. "And you suspect sabotage?" Damn right I do. And I can't trust my own people to look into it without tipping the culprit off. I need someone outside the business, someone discreet, someone precise. You do not require flattery, Wolfe said, pointing a fork at him. And I do not require intrusion during dinner. Have you brought a written outline of the events? No, Hackett said, shifting. I thought it best to speak to you directly, in confidence. You presume much. Archie. Yes, sir. I stepped forward. Mr. Hackett, if you'd care to step with me into the office, we'll take down the details. That is, if you're truly serious. Hackett turned toward me, then looked back at Wolfe. You'll consider it? I will decide whether to consider it after I have eaten, Wolfe said. Fritz, who had been standing silently as only Fritz can, watching to make sure the steak met its fate with honor, finally nodded and moved to clear Hackett's intrusion. From the sanctum, we went into the office and sat. Hackett had the energy of a man who expected results yesterday and a temper to match. Over the next 20 minutes he sketched the broad strokes of a situation that, in his eyes, was the beginning of an organized dismantling of his company. Not ruined by incompetence, ruined by someone clever, patient, and close enough to tweak the machinery just a little at a time. I've already fired 3 warehouse men, Hackett said. I've got my shipping manager under watch, but whoever's doing this knows how to stay just on this side of invisible. And you think they're inside the company? I'd bet a side of brisket on it. I nodded. What about rivals? Plenty of those, but no one has the access to slip things into our chain like this. Unless I'm being helped to fail. That line stuck with me. It wasn't paranoia, it was too precise for that. It had the ring of a man who knew what sabotage felt like and had tasted it in his balance sheets. When Wolfe finally came into the office, a full 45 minutes later, post-beer, post-poached pears, he lowered himself into the red leather chair, laced his fingers across his belly, and studied Hackett like a botanist, reviewing a strange but promising seedling. I have heard your story, he said, and I find it unpleasant. Still, you may leave the preliminary files with Mr. Goodwin. I will consider your problem in the morning. How you mean you'll take the case? I mean, Wolfe said with a hint of acid, that I will consider considering it. Hackett didn't like that, but he left. He wasn't used to being the junior partner in a negotiation. As the door closed, behind him I turned to Wolfe. Okay, boss. Want to tell me why you're even letting this one get past the vestibule? I thought industrial beef politics was strictly off the menu. Wolfe gave a small grunt. I tasted Hackett beef once, 2 years ago. It was excellent. This, he gestured toward his empty plate, was not. There is a difference, and I wish to know why. That was as close as Wolfe would ever come to admitting personal interest. The next morning began like most mornings at the Brownstone, with Wolfe up in the plant rooms from 9 to 11, Fritz preparing breakfast with enough precision to shame a Swiss watchmaker, and me doing my usual dance with paperwork that was neither pressing nor pleasant. I was at my desk in the office when the phone rang at 10:16. The voice on the other end was tense, nasal, and just familiar enough to be annoying. This is Tom Vetter. I'm with Hackett Packing. Mr. Hackett said you might be calling, but he didn't say you'd be investigating. Easy there, Mr. Vetter, I said, switching the phone to my left ear and grabbing a pencil. No one's sneaking up behind you. Wolfe hasn't taken the case yet. I'm just getting the lay of the land. Vetter huffed. Then you can tell Wolfe the land is well laid. I've got 5 foremen to supervise, 6 drivers on payroll, and a processing staff who know their business. We've had a rough couple of weeks, sure, but it's nothing we can't handle in-house. Glad to hear it. So the spoiled order to Franco's Trattoria, the missing consignment to Wilton and Ames, the brisket that showed up marbled like a tar pit? That, he snapped, was a supplier issue. Of course, one that happened 3 times, all coincidentally involving Hackett Packing's signature premium cuts. I'm not going to be talked down by a gumshoe with a notepad, Vetter growled. Tell Mr. Wolfe that if he wants answers, he can pick up the phone himself. I'll Put it right on his to-do list, I said sweetly, and hung up before he could. That confirmed something I'd suspected since the night before. Whoever was undermining Hackett's company had friends, or enemies, in the right places to make themselves invisible. And Hackett's staff weren't all exactly raising their hands to cooperate. At 11, Wolfe came down from the plant rooms in the kind of mood he usually reserved for a disappointing sausage. He settled behind his desk without a word, hands on the chair arms, eyes closed for a full 30 seconds before speaking. Report. I gave him the transcript of my call with Vetter, edited for length but not flavor, he grunted. Then he is either the saboteur or the saboteur's unknowing accomplice. Do not waste time appealing to his reason. He will offer none. Glad you said it, not me, I replied. So what's the plan? You want me to poke around the Hackett offices? Not yet. First, we require a list of those with authority over supply chain decisions, purchasing, packing, shipping, and delivery. That list must include contractors, consultants, and any recent hires. I take it I'm not asking Vetter for it. You are not. Contact Mr. Hackett. Request a private luncheon somewhere outside his company premises. I wish to assess his usefulness as a source before we place any further reliance on him. You're going to interview a client in person. I lifted my eyebrows. Should I alert the press? He opened his eyes and gave me a level stare. Do not be jejune. You will attend in my stead. I will prepare you with questions. Of course. The usual arrangement. And Archie, Wolfe said, observe Mr. Hackett's appetite. It will tell you much about his disposition. That afternoon, I met Hackett at a spot on the east side that specialized in dry-aged sirloin and silence. Hackett arrived on time and greeted me like a man prepared to enjoy himself despite the circumstances. I had a feeling you'd call, he said, easing into the booth. You want a real steak? This is the place. Wolfe wants details, I replied. I'll settle for steak. Over medium-rare ribeye and creamed spinach, Hackett cleaned his plate with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for sweepstakes wins. I got the names Wolfe wanted. 4 key players had access to procurement and logistics. Tom Vetter, head of operations, whose people skills came with sandpaper. Margot Lenz, corporate procurement, in charge of final cuts and specialty orders. Freddie Dial, a warehouse supervisor, relatively new and reportedly sharp. Danny Perot, head of shipping, retiring next month and already halfway packed metaphorically. I made a note of all of them. Hackett leaned back, wiped his mouth, and signaled for coffee. If you ask me, he said, it's Vetter. He's been pushing for automated systems, wants to downsize and modernize, keeps saying we don't need legacy beef culture, idiot phrase, but he's not stupid. If he wanted me out, this is exactly how he'd do it, by ruining me subtly, just enough to look like I'm slipping. Would he benefit? He's got backers. He's been talking to venture capital people. Quietly, but I hear things. Nodded. And what about Margot Lenz? Smart. Maybe too smart. Comes from high-end restaurant supply. Thinks the whole place is still stuck in the 1950s. She and Vetter are friendly. How friendly? Hackett hesitated. Not romantic, if that's what you're implying, but they vote together at board meetings. That was enough to mark her as someone who might turn a blind eye or help turn a knife. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office already mid-session with a bottle of beer and a look that told me he'd been thinking things through while I was doing the walking. Well, he said. I gave him the rundown. Names, roles, relationships. When I got to the part about Vetter's modernization talk, he held up a hand. That is the crux. Sabotage designed to erode trust in the current leadership without implicating the Yao. Saboteur directly. It requires access, planning, and indirection. Vetter's refusal to speak with you confirms either guilt or pride. He closed his eyes. We will require Saul Panzer. Contact him. Have him begin a discreet review of the Hackett warehouse procedures, especially the overnight security and dispatch logs. Done. And Archie, tomorrow morning I want you to visit Miss Lenz. Approach her as a supply consultant. Gain her confidence. Do not tell her we suspect anything. That's your subtle bait, huh? He didn't smile. If she is innocent, she will not notice. If she is not, she will reveal herself trying to mislead you. And what if she doesn't talk at all? Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands. She will talk. Women like Miss Lenz always do. He said it as though it were a universal law. With Wolfe sometimes it was. By the time I was knocking on Margot Lenz's office door the next morning, I'd learned two things. 1, she wasn't easy to find. 2, once found, she wasn't the type you walked up to without straightening your tie and your pitch. Her office was on the 12th floor of a high-rise on West 37th, slick and corporate, definitely not where meat gets butchered, but where contracts do. It had the air of clean glass and quiet ambition. A blonde receptionist with a clipboard and the posture of a sorority sergeant gave me the once-over before calling in my name. Miss Lenz can spare you 15 minutes, she said, making it sound like I'd been granted diplomatic access to a small kingdom. I thanked her and stepped in. Margot Lenz was behind a minimalist desk, dressed in a slate-grey blouse with a collar sharp enough to slice paper. She had short, precise hair, eyes like polished steel, and the manner of someone who expected the world to be 10 minutes late and 2 excuses deep. Mr. Goodwin, you said you were doing research for a logistics consultancy, she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. That's right. We're reviewing trends in perishable supply failures, tracking where loss occurs in mid-sized distribution networks. Hackett's operation came up. Her lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. Of course it did. We've had a rough quarter. I'm not here to point fingers. We're trying to identify where procedures break down when human oversight meets mechanical dependence. You mean when someone forgets to check a fridge? Or when a forklift knocks a crate loose and no one notices until the order gets sent out reeking? Something like that. We're also seeing signs of targeted interference in some firms, bad actors inside trying to edge things toward failure just enough to cause doubt. That did make her smile, though it had the warmth of ice in gin. Well, if you're looking for espionage, I suggest you head over to the fast food sector. They're cannibalizing themselves hourly. I made a note, not on my pad, but in my head. She dodged with humor. Smooth humor, the kind that puts you at ease just long enough to stop watching her hands. I let my eyes drift across the room. On the wall behind her was a framed photograph of her standing beside Reuben Hackett and a tall man I didn't recognize. Silver-haired, dressed like a yacht club admiral with Wall Street money. I gestured to it. Company royalty. Myself. Mr. Hackett and Arnold Ackerley. He's an investor, owns 10% of the board. Still active. Oh, very. Mr. Ackerley's the kind of man who keeps a finger on every pulse and a shoe in every door. And Vetter. Tom? He's effective. Not the warmest presence, but he knows how to run an operation. Word is, he's looking to overhaul Hackett Packing into something more tech-forward. She leaned back. That's true, and I don't disagree. Legacy operations are more vulnerable than ever. Digitization isn't just smart, it's necessary. But Hackett's not convinced? Reuben's a traditionalist. He believes a handshake and a good cut of sirloin are all you need to run a company. He's wrong, but he's honest about it. That, finally, felt like a sliver of real sentiment. Not enough to hang a theory on, but enough to confirm there was more than boardroom indifference behind her words. I won't take more of your time, I said, standing. But if you think of anything, any supply irregularities, order discrepancies, or behavior shifts, here's my card. She took it without comment, then looked up as I turned to leave. Mr. Goodwin. Yes. If someone were undermining the company, they'd be careful, slow. And they'd aim for trust, not just numbers. Misplaced trust and the whole thing falls. I gave her a nod. Good tip. I'll pass that along. Back at the brownstone, I reported the meeting to Wolfe in detail. Her words, her attitude, the photograph on the wall, and the mention of Arnold Ackerley. She's composed, I said. Too composed. Not defensive, not hostile, but a little too polished for someone whose company is bleeding contracts. She fears exposure, Wolfe muttered. Not as a culprit, but as a professional. Her competence is her armor, and Hackett's failure would be an embarrassment to her unless she anticipates replacing him. She didn't say as much. She didn't need to. At 3 o'clock, Saul Panzer arrived. Wolfe greeted him with the kind of courtesy he reserved for royalty and orchid growers. Saul, in turn, sat in the red chair and laid out his findings like a surgeon presenting x-rays. Hackett's warehouse has blind spots, he began. Not camera-wise, those are new, but procedural. The overnight shift logs are vague, and more than one crate leaves without proper sign-off. That started 3 weeks ago. Coinciding. With the first failed delivery, Wolfe said. Saul nodded. Also, there's a guy, Freddie Dial, warehouse supervisor. He came in 4 months ago from a seafood distributor out of Baltimore. Clean record, but he's tight with the drivers. Too tight. There's side talk going on. No one's saying anything, but I've seen the patterns before. Could Dial be making substitutions? I asked. Slipping in inferior meat? Possibly. If you don't check the labels and the crates are sealed, it's easy to swap one grade for another. 1 or 2 per shipment over time, it adds. Up Wolfe's fingers tapped together. The enemy within, not dramatic but effective, Archie. I want a meeting with Dial. Let me guess, I said, not here. Certainly not. Invite him to a neutral location. Say we're interested in a private security consultation. Appeal to his ego. I called Hackett and arranged it. The man didn't like it, but he trusted Wolfe enough to go along. Dial agreed to meet the next morning at a diner in Midtown. I'd be there naturally, wearing my best smile and my worst tie. That night something odd happened. Fritz came into the office around 7:30 with a look on his face I hadn't seen since the time Wolfe tried to substitute. Parsnips in a cassoulet. I did not remove it, he said. Remove what? The spice jar, the piment d'Espelette. It was on the shelf this morning. It is gone. Now that might not mean much to you, but to Wolfe that was like stealing the family silver, spitting on his manuscripts and slapping Fritz all in one gesture. He turned in his chair slowly, and his voice was like marble on ice. No one enters the kitchen without Fritz, Archie. No one's been in, not since Monday, except we both thought of it at the same time. Hackett. He'd passed through the kitchen when Fritz had brought in the steak. Just long enough. But what would Hackett want with a spice jar? Check the inventory, Wolfe said tightly. Everything, every ingredient, every tool. I want a full account. Yes, sir. He closed his eyes, and for once there was no beer, just silence. Someone, he said after a long moment, is trespassing. Not merely in commerce, but in taste. That will not stand. And I knew then the case had changed. It wasn't just sabotage. It was personal. At 9:15 the next morning, I was seated at a chrome-edged table in a midtown diner that hadn't seen a renovation since the Eisenhower administration. The coffee was hot, the eggs overdone, and the man across from me, Freddie Dial, had the expression of someone who figured himself the smartest guy in the joint and didn't mind if you knew it. He was in his early 30s, with the kind of athletic bulk you usually see behind a meat counter or in a boxing gym. His jacket was cheap but clean, his boots polished, and he had a little smirk he wore like an accessory. I'd ordered a plate of scrambled eggs just to keep up appearances, but I didn't plan to touch them. Dial, on the other hand, ordered steak and eggs and tucked in like he was auditioning for a truck stop commercial. So you said this was about private security, he said between bites. That you were scouting talent? I gave him my best. Poker face. Something like that. The firm I work with occasionally needs men who know the inside of a distribution network. Supply chain minds who can sniff out where things go wrong. Logistics failures, inside tampering, that sort of thing. He snorted. You came to Hackett for that. Man, that place is old meat wrapped in fancy paper. Half the systems we use date back to the Bush era. The first Bush. Which is exactly why we're interested, I said smoothly. We're seeing a pattern. Failures that don't look like accidents. Cuts showing up a grade lower. Orders going out wrong. That means someone inside knows the machinery and how to lean on it. Dial paused, fork halfway to his mouth. You think it's me? I smiled. I think you're in a position to know. And if you did, well, let's say the right people would rather hire the smart ones than chase 'em. He set down his fork, sat back and gave me a long look. You know, you talk like you read too many detective novels. Only the ones with good endings. He chewed that over while chewing a piece of gristle. Then he said, Look, I came to Hackett for a paycheck. Before that, I was with Eastern Bay Seafood in Baltimore. They ran a tight ship, but they got more. Bought out and cleaned house. Hackett offered me a bump in pay and a key to the loading dock. I took it. I don't want a promotion. I want a schedule. Anyone ever approach you? Try to get you to monkey with a shipment? His eyes narrowed, but his tone stayed casual. Nope. And if they did, I'd tell 'em where they could stick it. I ain't about to blow my job for someone else's hustle. I believed him, mostly. He didn't flinch, but something in his posture said he knew there was a hustle. He just didn't want to name names. Then who would? I pressed. You've been there 4 months. You've seen who's running things, who's got the reach to make this stuff happen without leaving fingerprints. He shrugged. Vetter's got his nose in everything. He's the kind of guy who keeps notes on who takes too long on lunch. And Margot, she's smooth, real smooth, but she don't talk unless she's planning something. Planning what? He shook his head. Don't know, but she's got her own calendar if you... Get me, I did. It matched the vibe I'd picked up at her office. Precise, professional, and a half-step ahead of everyone else. I thanked him, paid the check, and walked out with a nagging itch between my shoulder blades. Dial wasn't the saboteur, but he was close enough to smell the smoke. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my account while pouring himself a glass of beer and ignoring the pile of mail I'd left on his desk. When I got to Dial's comment about Margot Lenz having her own calendar, Wolfe's eyes flicked open. That is a telling phrase, he murmured. It suggests she is neither entirely loyal to Hackett nor entirely rogue. She may be maneuvering independently, perhaps for leverage, or exit. Exit? Yes, consider. A company showing signs of internal failure becomes ripe for acquisition. A senior executive who has positioned herself as competent amidst the collapse becomes a desirable asset. She's tanking the ship to become the only one with a lifeboat. It is possible, but she is not alone. He reached for the notepad he'd been scribbling on since morning, names and times in his precise script. Observe, he said, tapping the pad. Arnold Ackerley, the investor. I saw him in a photo with Lenz and Hackett. Yes, a man with quiet influence and little scrutiny. If Ackerley stands to benefit from Hackett Packing's diminished valuation, and Lenz is his preferred lieutenant, then the sabotage isn't just internal mischief, it's a leveraged play. Exactly. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered and returned a moment later with a slip of paper and a raised brow. Mr. Hackett is here. Wolfe didn't grunt, but he did sigh. Very well, show him in. Hackett came in looking like a man who'd had his name erased from a marquee. His usual bullish confidence had slipped. He looked rumpled, tense, and about 10 pounds lighter in the face. Wolfe, he said, not bothering to sit. Something's happened. I surmised that. This morning, a client, Madison & Cord, cancelled their contract. That's the 4th this month. They said our last order arrived late and half frozen. That's impossible. I had it packed personally. I stood. You supervised the shipment? Yes. I checked the crates myself. I watched it get loaded. But the receiver says it showed up warm. Who handled transport? Wolfe asked. Perot. Same driver, nothing unusual. Wolfe closed his eyes and I knew something had snapped into place behind his forehead. Archie, he said, get Saul. I want that delivery traced. Every stop, every delay, every driver contact. Perot may be being used, or he may be the liver. Hackett turned to me. You think someone's paying my people to screw me? We don't think, I said. We verify. He nodded grimly. Well, verify this. Last night, someone tried to access the internal financial system. Our IT guy flagged it. He thought it was a glitch, but when he checked the logs, there was a login attempt from a remote address. Do you have a timestamp? 1:42 a.m. Wolfe's voice was suddenly cool and sharp. And who has remote access privileges? Hackett hesitated. Me, Vetter, Margot, and Ackerley. There it was. The list was narrowing. After Hackett left, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes, then spoke in a low tone. This is no longer merely sabotage. It is a hostile maneuver, possibly an attempt at internal seizure. You think Ackerley's behind it? He is at the center of the vortex. Whether he controls it or merely benefits remains to be seen. And the spice jar? Wolfe grimaced. Symbolic, a warning or a test. Whoever took it wanted to see if I would notice. I did. That night, after dinner, I found Fritz standing in the pantry, arms folded, staring at the shelves like they'd insulted his mother. It's back, he said flatly. What is? The Piment d'Espelette. I looked. Sure enough, the small glass jar had reappeared on the exact spot it had vacated 2 nights before, unopened, untouched. Someone had slipped in, then out again. That, more than anything else, told me the game had escalated. Someone wasn't just sabotaging Hackett packing, they were baiting Nero Wolfe. The next morning, Wolfe was in no mood for trifles, which in our house includes breakfast conversation, minor inquiries, and anything resembling speculation. He descended from the plant rooms at precisely 11, slower than usual, but with the kind of stillness that made the air in the room feel a few degrees colder. He took his seat behind the desk, poured himself a glass of beer, and said without preamble, "The reappearance of the Piment d'Espelette is a message. Someone is toying with us." I had my own thoughts about that, but I knew better than to interrupt a Wolfe monologue once it had cleared the runway. Returning the item untouched, he continued, demonstrates familiarity with this household. It suggests not only boldness, but foreknowledge. Someone knew that I would miss it, and someone knew that I would not dismiss it. That requires not merely access, but understanding. Meaning it wasn't a random swipe by a client with sticky fingers, I said. It was planted like a breadcrumb, more precisely like a gauntlet. Wolfe set the glass down. We are being challenged, not for our participation, but for our reaction, and you're rising to it. I have already risen. He turned his gaze toward me. Has Mr. Panzer reported on the Madison and Cord shipment? Saul just called in before you came down. He followed the trail from warehouse to drop-off. The van left the Hackett facility on time, intact. Made one unscheduled stop at a roadside diner about 40 minutes into the trip. 10 minutes later, it resumed. Perot claimed it was a coffee break. During a high-priority delivery? That's what Saul thought too. So he checked the back of the diner. Trash bins, grease traps, anything that might have hosted our man. Found a strip of plastic packing wrap that didn't match the diner's own shipping materials. Looked a lot like something from Hackett's. Inventory. Wolfe inhaled through his nose. Then Perot opened the van, either to tamper with the meat or to allow someone else to do so. That's Saul's thinking, no direct proof, of course, but it smells wrong. Wolfe frowned. The absence of proof is not the absence of guilt. Perot may not be the architect, but he is an instrument, At that moment, the phone rang. I got it. Archie Goodwin speaking. "Archie, this is Margot Lenz." She didn't sound cool and polished this time. She sounded wound tight, like someone who'd rehearsed a calm tone and was losing the battle. "I just received an email from Tom Vetter," she said. "A blind copy, clearly sent to the board. It includes excerpts from my financial reports and claims that I've been manipulating vendor pricing. He's accusing me of inflating costs and rerouting orders to a side company I supposedly control. Do you?" "No, I swear. I wouldn't touch that kind of thing with a 10-foot ledger. But he has documents, partial ones, forged or doctored. I don't know. And now Ackley's calling an emergency meeting to review my position. Where are you now?" "At my office, but I'm not staying long. I don't like the feel of this." "Sit tight," I said. "I'll be there in 20. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. Looks like Vetter just lobbed the next grenade. "He's accusing Lenz of fraud." Wolfe didn't blink. "Then he is either the traitor or the diversion. Go, assess, return." I nodded and grabbed my coat. "Anything you want me to ask?" "Yes. Ask her if the name Meridian Holdings means anything to her." That stopped me mid-stride. "Meridian Holdings?" "Ackley's private shell company. He uses it for soft takeovers. If Miss Lenz is being set up, it may be so Ackley can replace her with someone more malleable, possibly Vetter." I let out a low whistle. "This is getting crowded." "It is narrowing," Wolfe said. "Now go." When I reached Margot's office, she was already packing. Not panicked, she didn't seem the type, but brisk, methodical. Her jacket was slung over a chair. Her phone was buzzing with texts she was ignoring, and her eyes were red, not from crying but from not blinking enough. "He blindsided me," she said, not looking up. "Vetter. He's been trying to consolidate authority ever since Hackett started questioning deliveries. This is his move. Knock me out, take over supply, and position himself as the savior of the company." I sat down across from her. "Any idea how he got his hands on the documents?" "Probably through IT. He's been friendly with one of the techs, some kid named Bryce. I never trusted him." "And Meridian Holdings?" I asked casually. That made her pause. "What?" "Meridian Holdings," Wolfe said to ask. She went very still. "I saw that name last week. Small line item buried in one of our suppliers' logs. It was tied to a freight invoice. I flagged it, but when I went back the next day, it had been deleted. Think Ackley's pulling strings, her." Jaw tightened. "He and Vetter have been having meetings, off-site, unrecorded. Hackett doesn't know, or maybe he doesn't want to know." "Would you testify to that?" "I would," she said, "if I keep my job long enough to testify to anything." I left her with my card again and told her not to go far. Then I headed back to the brownstone, feeling like I'd just walked into a boardroom version of Russian roulette, where the bullets were contracts and the gun had everyone's name on it. Back in the office, Wolfe listened with closed eyes, then gave a small nod. "As I thought, Ackley and Vetter are initiating a takeover. They are sabotaging Hackett's supply chain to drive down his valuation. Once he folds, they will restructure, with Vetter in operational control and Ackley maintaining ownership through Meridian Holdings. Lenz was a risk, too competent, too independent, so they arranged for her to be discredited. Why not? Just fire her. Hackett trusts her. Public discreditment undermines his judgment. It weakens his moral authority within the board, which helps them push him out. Precisely. I ran a hand through my hair. "So what's the move? You want to bring everyone in?" "Not yet," Wolfe said. "One more act remains." He turned to the intercom and buzzed Fritz. "Fritz, inform Mr. Hackett that I require his presence tomorrow at 10, and prepare. The front room for 6 guests." Fritz acknowledged with a soft, "Very good, sir." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "We will have them all here. Hackett, Lenz, Vetter, Dial, Ackley, and Perot. Each will bring their lies, and I will unravel them." "And the Paiement d'Espelette." Wolfe's eyes opened, slow and deliberate. "Leave it where it is. It has served its purpose. He paused, then added, "Have the carpet cleaned. I suspect someone will spill something tomorrow." He didn't mean wine. The next morning was one of those Manhattan spring days that makes you forget all about winter. Slush and summer sweat. Not that any of it mattered inside the brownstone, where the temperature was determined solely by Wolfe's mood, and right then it was glacial. At 9:58 a.m. the bell rang. Fritz opened the door for Reuben Hackett, who entered the front room, looking like a man trying not to look like he was about to get dissected. He had a dark blue suit that probably fit better 6 months ago, and his collar was tugging at his neck as though it were trying to keep him honest. Behind him came Margot, Lenz, Tom Vetter, Freddie Dial, Danny Perot, and finally right on cue Arnold Ackerley, smooth as satin and twice as slick. He wore a pale linen suit that made him look like he was running for governor of a state that didn't exist, and he carried a folded copy of the Wall Street Journal under one arm like a Declaration of Independence. Fritz ushered them all into Wolfe's office with the sort of politeness that could chill soup. I followed, pad in hand, and leaned against the wall. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He was already behind his desk, composed as a stone Buddha who'd just finished brunch. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, "you have been summoned here not as a courtesy but as a necessity. Your presence concerns a series of deliberate disruptions at Hackett Packing, culminating in damage to its reputation, finances, and structural integrity." No one said a word, but Vetter shifted in his chair, and Dial scratched the back of his neck like a man expecting an itch to turn into a subpoena. Wolfe continued, his voice even and cool. "Before we begin, let us establish the premise. The sabotage was not incidental, it was calculated, designed not merely to harm, but to erode, and not by an outsider, but by one or more of you." Ackerley gave a chuckle. "Mr. Wolfe, surely. We're not here for a theatrical inquisition. If Mr. Hackett has operational issues, that's for his board to handle." "You'll speak when addressed," Wolfe said without looking at him. "Not before." That shut Ackerley up. Wolfe turned, slightly. "Miss Lenz, you were recently accused by Mr. Vetter of financial misconduct. Do you deny it?" "I do. The documents he presented are forged or altered. I never rerouted orders, never padded supplier costs, and never established a secondary vendor." "Yet the evidence exists." She gave a tight nod. "Yes, it exists. It just isn't true." Wolfe turned to Vetter. "You have presented these allegations. Do you assert them as fact?" "I do," Vetter said. "I verified the logs myself. The transactions tie back to Lenz's approval credentials." Wolfe reached to his desk and pressed a button. A click sounded from a recorder, one of the rare pieces of modern technology Wolfe tolerated, and Saul Panzer's voice filled the room. "Clear and professional. Shipment tampered with during an unauthorized stop. Driver Danny Perot exited the vehicle for 10 minutes. Back door of the van unsealed. Found Hackett packing wrap in diner trash." Perot's face turned the color of expired pork. "I needed coffee," he said, barely audible. "Indeed," Wolfe said. "And in that interval, inferior product was swapped for premium inventory, a tactic repeated in 4 separate deliveries, consistently on your routes." I didn't know what was in the crates." "You didn't need to. You only needed to unlock the door." Perot sank lower in his seat. Wolfe shifted his gaze. "Mr. Dial, you arrived at Hackett 4 months ago. Since then, warehouse. Protocols have become increasingly vague. Overlapping manifests, misaligned timestamps explain." Dial looked from Hackett to Wolfe, then to me, as if hoping someone might toss him a line. "No one did? I was told to loosen the checks," he muttered. "I didn't ask why." "By whom?" He hesitated. "Speak, Mr. Dial," Wolfe said, voice dropping a register. "Vetter," Dial said at last. "Said the tight protocols were slowing things down. Said we needed more efficiency." Hackett turned on Vetter. "Is that true?" "Of course not," Vetter snapped. "He's trying to cover his own rear. You think I'd tell him to—" "Sabotage your inventory." "You already tried to sabotage me through Margot," Hackett said. "What's one more?" "Gentlemen," Wolfe said firmly, "this is not a courtroom. You will not shout in my office." He turned his gaze to the final piece of the puzzle. "Mr. Ackerley." Ackerley gave a small smile, as if trying to decide whether to play dumb or condescending. He settled for amused. "Yes? You own 10% of Hackett Packing. You also own, through a web of intermediaries, a controlling stake in Meridian Holdings." Ackerley didn't reply. "Meridian Holdings," Wolfe went on, "has been acquiring freight contracts for several Hackett partners, quietly, consistently, including the transport company used by Perrault's last 3 runs. Still nothing from Ackerley. He merely crossed his legs. Furthermore, a financial analyst retained by me traced a series of email headers from Meridian's holding server to a laptop registered under your name. You used Vetter's allegations against Miss Lenz as a distraction, creating a vacancy in the company's leadership, while simultaneously driving Hackett's valuation downward through supply chain sabotage. At last, Ackerley spoke. "You have no jurisdiction, no authority. What you have is conjecture." "What I have," Wolfe said, "is leverage." He picked up a manila folder and handed it to Hackett. "In that folder are notarized statements from Miss Lenz, Mr. Dial, and Mr. Perrault, attesting to procedural manipulation at the direction of Mr. Vetter, under your tacit protection. Also included is a transaction history showing payments from a Meridian subsidiary to the driver's sister's bank account. Her name is listed as a consultant." Ackerley stiffened. "You can, of course, refute this," Wolfe said. "But if you do, I will release this information to the press. You will survive. Hackett Packing, however, will not." "Silence!" Then Hackett, standing, turned to Vetter and Ackerley. "You're both done." Wolfe spoke once more. "You will transfer your holdings to Mr. Hackett at par value. Mr. Vetter will resign. Miss Lenz will resume full operational control, and Mr. Dial will be retained under close supervision." He sipped his beer. "Or you may refuse, and face a legal onslaught and media scandal you are not equipped to manage." Ackerley stood slowly, adjusted his cuffs, and offered a ghost of a nod. "Very well." And just like that, the game ended, an E. Hour later, they were gone. The brownstone returned to its natural state, silent, dignified, and just a touch smug. I came back in from seeing Hackett out, and found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him. "Chair, beer, orchids?" "Well," I said, "you've saved a meat empire, dethroned a schemer, and restored spice to its rightful shelf. Not bad for a Thursday." Wolfe gave me a sidelong glance. "Ambition," he said, "is tolerable only when tempered by competence. Without it, it spoils, like meat left in the sun. Speaking of which, lunch?" He lifted a hand. "Fritz is preparing côte de bœuf, properly aged, properly spiced." He closed his eyes. At 3:45 that afternoon, I was sitting in the office leafing through a fresh delivery of unpaid bills and circulars when Saul Panzer came by for the post-mortem. Wolfe had already retired upstairs to spend the next hour whispering sweet Latin. Nothings to his orchids, leaving the rest of us mortals to decompress without his philosophical commentary on justice, sabotage, or meat. Saul, ever Saul, took his seat in the red chair without needing to be asked, and crossed one ankle over a knee. "You dropped a brick on Ackerley's foot," he said. "Impressive. He'll limp for weeks." I grinned. "Wolfe might not walk 10 steps in a day, but he can chase down a saboteur like a bloodhound on rails. You were right about Perrault. That stop at the diner was the hinge in the whole plan." Saul nodded. "The packing slip in the dumpster clinched it. Not enough for court, but plenty for leverage. You ever notice how often this city runs on suggestion instead of proof?" "In our line of work," I said, "proof is overrated. Credible threats do the trick. I got up, grabbed 2 bottles of mineral water from the fridge, and handed one to Saul. Anyway, we've got Wolfe to thank for threading the needle. He spotted the play while the rest of us were still fumbling for the ball. The moment the spice jar vanished, he knew someone had tested his boundaries. Saul opened the bottle and took a sip. They always underestimate him. I don't know why. I thought about that. The mistake wasn't uncommon. Wolfe's size, his routines, his flat refusal to leave his own house, it all made him look like an eccentric gourmet with too many books and not enough drive. But those who underestimated him once never made that mistake again. Unless, of course, they were in handcuffs. At 4:30, Wolfe came down, a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, and the unmistakable smell of orchid fertilizer clinging to his cuffs. He settled into his chair and accepted a glass of beer from Fritz, without acknowledging either of us. Saul took that as his cue and stood. "You need anything else, Wolfe?" "No, thank you, Mr. Panzer. You have been invaluable, as always." That was Wolfe's version of a standing ovation. Saul nodded and left, brushing his hat brim in my direction as he passed. Wolfe sipped. Then, after a long moment, he spoke. "Ackerley will retreat, but not quickly. Men like him believe recovery is inevitable. They do not accept defeat until it is chronic." "So he might try again?" I asked. "He will try something, not here, not now, but elsewhere. Sabotage was only one tool in his box." "You want to keep an eye on him?" "No. He is no longer our concern." That from Wolfe was final. I settled back into my chair and stretched my legs out. You ever wonder how these corporate types sleep at night? Driving down a man's company, torching reputations, bribing drivers through their sister's bank. "Accounts, no," Wolfe said. "Because they sleep quite well. They consider it strategy." He took another sip. "Mr. Hackett is fortunate. He retains his company. Miss Lenz will ensure its survival, perhaps even its evolution. And you, Archie, have again proved that a blunt instrument may yet serve a delicate purpose." "Oh, now you're just sweet-talking me." "I am not. Still, feels good." We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us basking in the aftermath, which is always quieter and more peaceful than the storm that preceded it. Wolfe liked this part. The philosophical haze, the drifting descent after the peak. "I still think the spice jar was weird," I said. "It was meant to be weird," Wolfe replied. "Whoever took it and returned it understood me well enough to know I would interpret it not as theft, but as intrusion. A mental poke, a warning, an invitation, which you accepted. Yes, because it was an admission that the battle had already begun." That made sense in Wolfe's twisted logic kind of way. The kitchen was sacred. Fritz guarded it, like a Swiss vault, and Wolfe respected it as an extension of his own dignity. To remove a rare Basque chili powder wasn't just impolite, it was a declaration of intellectual war. "And what if it hadn't come back?" I asked. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, slightly. "Then I would have deduced a different sort of enemy, one who seeks chaos, not strategy, a petty thief instead of a tactician, less dangerous, more tiresome. So in a way the saboteur gave you a compliment. No, he gave me a mirror, and lost." He stood with some effort, and Fritz, ever the stage manager, appeared from nowhere, to support his elbow and collect the empty glass. "Dinner will be ready in half an hour," Fritz said. Wolfe nodded. "Good. Something nourishing, please. I've endured too much vinegar." After dinner, veal blanquette and a salad so crisp it could have sung soprano, Wolfe retired again, and I took the time to do the paperwork. A summary for Hackett's legal team, our invoice, and a statement for the files. It wasn't a job I relished, but it came with the territory. By the time I finished, the house was quiet. No ringing phones, no knock at the door, no notes from the police or clients with trembling hands and urgent envelopes. Just the kind of Stillness Wolfe craved. I closed the file and leaned back. You'd think that saving a business from collapse, uncovering corporate sabotage, and taking down 2 sharks in linen suits would be the kind of thing you'd celebrate with fireworks. Gasped a bottle of rye. But in our world the victory is in the silence. Wolfe doesn't cheer, he reflects. And me. I just wait for the next person to knock on the door with trouble under their arm. Before I turned in, I stopped in the kitchen to get a glass of water. Fritz was wiping down the counters with his usual reverence, and the spice shelves had been rearranged again. The piment d'Espelette was now second from the left, no longer quite in its old place. Thought you put it back exactly where it was, I said. Fritz paused, then gave a small nod. I did. But Mr. Wolfe said to shift it slightly. He said, and I quote, "Let it remain visible, but no longer invisible." Philosophy or paranoia? Fritz smiled. With Mr. Wolfe, they are not separate things. I took my glass and headed upstairs. The steak had been too rare, the plan too precise, and the saboteurs too confident, but Wolfe had seasoned the whole dish with something better than Espelette pepper, cold logic, and in the end, that was what made it digestible. It was 2 days after Wolfe had dismantled Ackley and Vetters, a quiet little coup, and the brownstone had returned to its natural rhythm, the slow, steady tick of domestic order. Fritz was once again trusting his pantry, Saul was off the case, and Wolfe had returned to the comfort of his orchid schedule, his armchair, and the reassuring weight of a well-chosen book. As for me, I was working through the backlog of correspondence, invoices, and the usual collection of lunatic letters from strangers who believed their neighbors were assassins in disguise. I had just tossed one such gem into the wastebasket. It involved a theory about poisoned gardenias and the Illuminati when the phone rang. Nero Wolfe's residence, Archie Goodwin speaking. "Archie, it's Margot." She didn't sound as nervous as last time, but she was still wound tighter than a snare drum. "I'm sorry to call unannounced," she said quickly, "but something's happened." "What kind of something?" "I'm not sure it's anything," she admitted. "But I thought Mr. Wolfe might want to know." I leaned back in my chair. "Go on." "I received a visitor today, someone I've never met before. Said he was a consultant doing due diligence for a private equity group. He asked a lot of questions about Hackett Packing, its vulnerabilities, its insurance structure, its recent disruptions." "Did he give a name?" "Yes, Willard Foy. That name didn't ring a bell." "You get a card?" "No, but I wrote down the name. He was careful. Too careful." "Did he ask about Wolfe?" "No, but he asked if Hackett would consider a buyout. Offered to put me in touch with someone who'd be sympathetic to her career aspirations if I helped smooth the process." "Smooth how?" "Leaning on Hackett to step aside. Positioning myself as interim CEO during a transitional audit." That was the phrase he used. I whistled low. "Sounds like the game's not over." "That's what I thought. I told him to get lost." But he didn't seem surprised. He just smiled and left. "Sit tight," I said. "I'll talk to Wolfe." When I relayed the conversation, Wolfe didn't even raise an eyebrow. He merely closed the book in his lap, The Art of Fermentation, and sighed. "They persist," he said. "Predictable. You think Ackley's already rebuilding. Of course, men like Ackley never play one game at a time. He has a dozen irons in the fire. This was simply one that didn't brand the steer. So what do we do?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" "Nothing overt," Wolfe clarified. "Miss Lenz has made her position clear. She refused an overture that could have made her powerful but beholden. That is the best defense. Integrity. Doesn't mean Foy won't try someone else. He will, but Hackett is no longer alone. He has her loyalty, and more importantly, he has my attention." That, from Wolfe, was more than bodyguards and armored trucks combined. Still, I felt like a loose end had wriggled free of the knot. And in our line of work, Loose ends had a habit of pulling threads until the whole thing came apart. At 5 p.m., we received another visitor. This one was expected. Reuben Hackett arrived with a modest bottle of red and a cut of beef that looked like it could have fed the Roman Senate. He'd insisted 2 days ago on thanking Wolfe in the only way he understood, through protein. Wolfe, for once, had not objected. We joined him in the dining room. Fritz had outdone himself, and I don't say that lightly. The steak was marbled. Like stained glass and cooked to perfection, medium rare in strict accordance with Wolfe's wishes, but without any of the pink blood spectacle that had inspired the case title. Wolfe took one bite, closed his eyes, and exhaled. For him, that was equivalent to a standing ovation, a curtain call, and a rave review in Gourmet Weekly. "It is as it should be," he said. "I figured you earned it," Hackett replied, lifting his glass. We toasted. Fritz had poured something French and serious, and then the silence took over. It was the good kind. Wolfe didn't like chatter over dinner unless it involved sauces, varietals, or the idiocy of public officials. After the meal, Hackett retired to the office with us and stood near the bookshelves nursing the last of his wine. "I owe you more than I can say," he said. "You didn't just save my business, you saved my name." "You owe me nothing," Wolfe replied. "You paid a fee, and more importantly, you listened when it counted." Hackett gave a nod and looked at me. "So what happens now?" "You do your job," I said. "You keep your warehouse tight, you keep your people honest, and if you see a man named Willard Foy hanging around, you introduce him to your legal team." That got a grim chuckle. "I'll do that." After Hackett left, Wolfe returned to his chair, poured another half-glass of beer, and settled back with a groan of satisfaction that vibrated the floorboards. That, he said, was meat worthy of a case. "So you'd do it again?" He gave me a sidelong glance. "I do not relish repetition, but I admit it was a savory puzzle." I tossed my notebook on the desk and leaned back. "You know, I keep thinking about the first time Hackett walked in here, said it started with a steak." "Yes," Wolfe mused. "Too rare." "Turns out," I said, "so was the man. Hackett's one of the few who didn't fold, didn't flinch, and didn't sell out." "Rarity," Wolfe said softly, "is not always a virtue, but in this case it was." I was about to agree when Fritz re-entered. "Coffee, sir?" "No," Wolfe said. "Not yet." He looked at me. "Archie, tomorrow remind me to write to the Basque cooperative that produces our Piment d'Espelette. I believe we should increase our order. Stocking up, protecting what matters." And with that, he reached for the latest issue of Gastronome Quarterly, opened it to a review of roast kid with rosemary, and shut out the world. The brownstone was quiet again. The meat had been worthy, the saboteur outflanked, and justice served, if not steaming, then at least perfectly seasoned. I turned out the office lights and closed the door behind me. Another case finished, another ego brought to heel, another quiet dinner earned. That was life with Wolfe. You never knew where it would start, but you always knew it would end with the last word. And the perfect bite. The next morning things began unusually. With Wolfe already seated in the office by the time I came down, it was barely 9:15, which for him qualified as dawn, and he was dressed, upright, and staring at the world through half-lidded eyes like a man daring it to try something stupid. That set off a dozen silent alarms in my head. Wolfe never beat me to the office unless something was simmering inside that vast dome of his, and today there was definitely something on the boil. He didn't look up as I entered. "Archie." "Good morning, you're up early. Or am I late?" "I received a phone call at 8:15, he said, like it was a crime against civilization. "From?" "Mr. Ackerley." That stopped me mid-step. I sat down. "He's got nerve." Indeed, he wished to clarify misunderstandings and assure me that his intentions regarding Hackett packing had always been above board. You believe him? Wolfe raised one eyebrow in a perfect arc. Archie, I don't believe in benevolence from sharks. Then why the call? Because he is considering suing Hackett for defamation, and he wishes to know whether I would testify in his favor. That earned a low whistle from me. He's got nerve and delusion. He has desperation. Wolfe lifted his glass, beer at this hour sure sign of stress, and sipped. And desperation often precedes clumsiness. You think he'll slip? He already has. That was all he said for the next 20 minutes. I waited, of course, because I've learned that when Wolfe holds his silence like a stage magician palming a coin, the trick is coming. It's just a matter of time. Sure enough, at 9:36, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew an envelope, which he slid across the surface toward me. Ackley sent this 2 weeks ago, he said. I had not opened it until this morning. It was marked Personal, Professional Inquiry. I had no interest in a consulting role in a meat-packing enterprise, and thus left it among the less urgent correspondence. Until now, he echoed. I opened the envelope. Inside was a typed letter on creamy, expensive stock, dated 10 days before Hackett ever walked through our door. It was short and direct, proposing a consultation fee for Wolfe's services in evaluating the internal efficiency of a legacy food distribution network. There was no mention of Hackett, no names, but the implication was clear. So he tried to hire you before he launched the sabotage? Yes. And when you ignored him, he proceeded without my cooperation, which of course is why he failed. I leaned back and let it all arrange itself. Ackley had made a move. Wolfe had declined, silently. Ackley had then tried to execute the plan without Wolfe's brainpower, substituting Vetter's ambition and Perot's loose morals. The result? Exposure, expulsion, and now panic. Want to tell Hackett? No. No. Wolfe shook his head. There is no value in prolonging the conflict. Ackley has already lost. Informing Hackett would serve only vengeance, not justice. You're mellowing with age. I am protecting the sanctity of my office from further entanglements. I gave that a nod of respect. So what's our next move? Our next move, he said, is to ensure that the chessboard remains ours. That afternoon I placed a quiet call to a firm of Wolfe's acquaintance, a discreet group of financial auditors with an appetite for quiet warfare. By 4 o'clock, they had agreed to monitor any sudden activity involving Meridian Holdings, its subsidiaries or surprise offers made to Hackett Packing. Just a shadow in the corner. Wolfe preferred his enemies lit by indirect light. Around 5, we got another call, this time from Margot Lentz. Her voice had steadied. No more tightness. She was in control again. I wanted to thank you both, she said. The board's standing behind Hackett. Vetter's out and Ackley's holding on to his last 10% like a man gripping a raft with a leak. Don't thank me, I told her. Wolfe's the one who saw through it all. I know, and I'll be recommending him quietly to people who need solutions without headlines. You do that. But don't send anyone who might move. A spice jar, she laughed. Deal. When I hung up, Wolfe looked pleased, which for him meant his scowl was merely neutral. Miss Lenz, he said, will thrive. She has seen ambition at its ugliest and did not flinch. She will now be better at navigating the waters. And Hackett. He will retreat into his comfort, his meat, his loyalty, and he will trust her more than ever. He paused. That is good. Dinner that night was Fritz's braised short ribs with a reduction so rich I considered opening an investment account for it. Wolfe ate with care and consideration, chewing not just for flavor, but for moral clarity. I could almost see him rebuilding the philosophical balance of the universe, bite by bite. Afterward, we returned to the office. I poured myself a small brandy, just this once. Wolfe had a final beer. We sat, the evening settling around us like a well-worn suit. You know, I said. I've been thinking. Oh? This whole thing, Ackley, the sabotage, the paiement d'Espelette, it was like watching a man trying to play a symphony with a butter knife. Ackley was not without talent, Wolfe replied, but he lacked one essential trait. What's that? Restraint. I raised my glass. To restraint. He nodded. And to rare steak, cooked just enough to be taken seriously. As I sipped, he leaned back and closed his eyes. Archie, he said after a long moment. Yeah? You did well. It was simple, soft, the kind of compliment he issued about as often as comets streaked the sky. Thanks, I said. He didn't answer. The beer was gone. The office was quiet. Outside, Manhattan breathed in shadows and neon. And Wolfe, sated, undefeated, and as unmovable as always, sat in his chair like a man who had eaten the world, found it palatable, and gone back for seconds. Wolfe didn't like post-case contact. His philosophy was that once a case was resolved, it should behave itself and vanish into memory, like dessert, enjoyed and done with. But 2 days after Ackley's half-hearted retreat and Vetter's fall from grace, the case didn't vanish. It came back, this time by mail. I was in the front room sorting through the usual delivery of invoices, catalogues, and the occasional death threat from someone we hadn't quite flattered enough when I found the envelope. Heavy stock, no return address, postmarked from an uptown Manhattan P.O. box. Inside, a single sheet, no signature. It read, "The butcher bleeds, but the cleaver still swings. That business is not yours. Stay out of it." There are a few ways to read a threat. One is to laugh. One is to investigate. One is to hand it straight to Nero Wolfe, which is what I did, after I checked it for powder, poison, and perfume, all three of which have come through that mail slot in our more colorful cases. He read it silently twice. Then, to my surprise, he folded it neatly and dropped it into the fireplace without a word. "You're not going to frame it?" I asked. "It is not worth preserving," he replied. "Someone's still upset." "Of course they are." "Someone has lost a great deal of money, time, and face. That they should attempt a feeble gesture of warning is not surprising. It is, in fact, tedious. But you don't think it's Ackley?" No, he prefers legal instruments to anonymous poetry." "Vetter? Possibly. Or one of his enablers. You want me to look into it?" "No." He picked up his copy of Pliny the Elder, which he was rereading for reasons I didn't ask, and didn't say another word about it. I took that as gospel. We were done. But that didn't stop me from checking the name on the post office box later that afternoon. Turns out it belonged to a holding company that, big surprise, was registered through the same financial trust that housed half a dozen of Ackley's silent ventures. Subtle it wasn't. But Wolfe was right. The gesture was small, sour, and too late. That night we were interrupted again, this time by Hackett. Unannounced. He arrived around 7, which for Wolfe was the equivalent of a house guest knocking at 2 a.m. Fritz looked at me like someone had stepped on the sacred carpet, in muddy shoes, and I intercepted Hackett in the front room before Wolfe could send up smoke signals. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. "Sorry to barge in." "Don't worry," I said. "You're not a cleaver swinger, are you?" That got a raised eyebrow. I explained the note. Hackett grunted. "I'll have my board's legal team dig into that. Sounds like the kind of thing Vetter would cook up after 2 bourbons and a bruised ego. He strikes me more as a gin sulker, but we'll let the law sort that out." I led him into the office. Wolfe didn't rise, of course, and he didn't speak until Hackett was fully seated, hat removed, posture deferential. "I won't keep you long," Hackett said. "I just wanted to say thank you again, properly. Not with meat, with words. You didn't just save the company. You saved the truth, and these days that seems harder to protect than money." Wolfe inclined his head slightly, which, from him, was like weeping with gratitude. "You were wrong about one thing, though," Hackett added. "Indeed. This didn't start with meat." Wolfe waited. So did I. "It started with people. People who thought they could cheat a system built on loyalty, trust, and quality. Meat was just the lever." "That is often the case," Wolfe said. "The lever, not the motive," Hackett nodded. "Well, we're rebuilding. Lenz has the reins and we're cleaning out the rats. But if you ever need a steak—" "I do not need steak," Wolfe interrupted, gently but firmly. "I require it only under conditions of dignity." That earned a smile. Hackett stood. "Understood." He left as quickly as he came, leaving only the faint scent of dry-aged sincerity behind. After he'd gone, Wolfe glanced at me. "You see, Archie, even a butcher may gain insight from the blade." "Deep," I said. "Shall I get you a pen?" "So you can etch it on the wine-cellar wall?" He ignored that, turned to his beer and drank with a look that bordered on contemplative. "Justice," he said, "is not often a matter of law. It is a matter of equilibrium." I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about Ackley, about the bitterness in that unsigned note, about the way Lenz had held her ground, and even about Freddie Dial, who had quietly disappeared from the sea. City as soon as the case wrapped. The cleaver had swung all right, but it had missed us. That night, as I closed the front door and turned the bolt, I found myself pausing. The street outside was quiet. A cab hummed past. Somewhere a dog barked. Once, and then thought better of it. Inside, the brownstone was exactly as it should be. Clean, contained, peaceful. Fritz was in the kitchen polishing copper. Wolfe was upstairs reading about Roman food rituals. I was leaning against the door, half smiling. Another case, folded and filed. The rare steak, the rare loyalty, the rare woman who didn't sell out. All resolved. Tomorrow someone else would come knocking, or calling, or writing notes in the mail like a half-wit poet. But tonight, for a few hours at least, everything made sense. The butcher had bled. The cleaver had missed. And Wolfe, well, Wolfe had finished his beer. And that, if you know the man, is as fine an ending as any story ever gets. The final piece came, as these things often do, not through a bullet, a scream, or a knock in the dead of night, but by envelope. Legal this time, not anonymous. It arrived 3 weeks after Hackett's visit on a Tuesday so quiet the orchids might have taken a nap. Fritz handed me the envelope with a lifted brow and that slight tightness at the corner of his mouth that meant he didn't like the look of it. Wolfe settled as always behind his desk with a book in one hand and a glass of chilled Moselle in the other, didn't look up when I sliced it open. Inside was a letter from Meridian Holdings law firm politely informing Wolfe that Arnold, Ackley, had sold his remaining shares in Hackett Packing and divested himself from all related holdings. They expressed appreciation for Wolfe's discretion, denied all impropriety in vague, elegant legalese, and concluded with a tone that could have doubled as the last gasp of a dying animal, pretending it wasn't dying. I read the letter aloud. When I finished, Wolfe took a moment to sip, then said, "It was inevitable." "What? The surrender?" "No. The delusion of grace." I tossed the letter onto the desk. "So, Ackley's out." He was out the moment. He offered me money to lie for him. This is merely the paperwork. I crossed my legs and leaned back. "You don't seem satisfied." "I am not dissatisfied," he replied. "That is the highest form of contentment a rational man should seek." I'd gotten used to that kind of Wolfism, but the truth was there was a note in his voice, a faint one but there, that told me he wasn't just philosophizing for show. The case had gotten under his skin, not for the usual reasons. There was no corpse, no newspaper headlines, no handcuffs. But there had been something else, the audacity of strategy without soul. Wolfe respected games of the mind. What he didn't respect was cheapness, masquerading as intellect. And Ackley's plot had been a fraud. not just of business but of character. Later that day, Margot Lentz called. She'd just finished restructuring the executive team. Dial had resigned officially and relocated to Chicago. Perot had disappeared. Entirely. Vetter had hired a lawyer and was quietly shopping his resume. "I just wanted to tell you," she said, "we've renamed our Quality Assurance Initiative." "Oh?" I said. "To what?" "The Wolfe Standard." I nearly dropped the phone. "He'll have a fit," I warned. "He doesn't have to know. He always knows." When I relayed it to Wolfe, gently, he didn't explode. He didn't snort. He didn't even lift his eyes from the Atlantic Monthly. But he did pause for a full 3 seconds. Then, with the faintest curve of lip that might have been a smile or just indigestion, he said, "Then she has learned something after all." That night, Fritz served duck confit with fennel puree and a cherry glaze so precise it should have come with a blueprint. Wolfe praised it in 3 syllables. For him, that was high treason against his usual stoicism. Over brandy, I asked the question that had been bugging me since the letter arrived. Why? "Didn't you tell Hackett about the original consulting offer Ackley made to you? The one you ignored?" Wolfe didn't answer right away. He swirled the brandy in its glass, watched it catch the lamplight. "Because it was irrelevant to the outcome," he said at last. "Hackett needed a victory unmarred by my involvement in its cause. He would have understood. Understanding is not the same as forgetting. So you let him believe the enemy came at him fresh." I let him believe the truth he could live with. I nodded. It made sense. Wolfe's kind of sense. Not always moral. Never dishonest, but precise, sharp-edged, and clinical. We closed up the office early that night. No case files, no scribbled clues. Just silence, warm lighting, and the city humming outside like a lullaby for detectives who prefer thought to action. Before I turned out the light, Wolfe looked at me. "Archie." "Yeah?" "You were tempted." That stopped me. "Tempted how?" "To accept their game, to push Hackett aside, to ally with power." Briefly, I admitted. "It would have been easy, but you didn't. Neither did you." "No," he said, "but I never do." He leaned back, eyes closing slowly. "Temptation," he said, "is only proof that we're paying attention." And that was it. The final word. The curtain, pulled with the same grace as a napkin before a proper meal. The case of the steak that was too rare had started, as so many things do in our world, with flavor. But it ended with character. The meat was marbled, the plan was rotten, the people were what mattered, and Wolfe, from his chair, had cut through it all with the sharpest knife. In the house, his mind,